You can follow a 24-hour news cycle and you'll get a lot of information, but what will you actually learn? And so one of the reasons I always try to read history, I try to go way back in time, is that I find I learn real information I can actually use. All right, so the Wall Street Journal asked me to recommend my favorite books of the year. For the last 10 years, I've been sending out this reading list email every month. I recommend the books that I've loved, that have changed me, that have improved me. And so I read dozens and dozens, sometimes hundreds of books a year. And because I'm able to do that, because it's my job, what I try to do at the end of the year is distill all those books down to the very best books that I read. So if all you read was just these books for the year, it would be a great year of reading. And look, this year has been rough. It's been rough for everyone. It's been rough for me. It's been rough for my family. It's been rough for friends, colleagues. But the one upside about it, the one upside of less travel, less meetings, less dinners out with friends, is that it has been more time for reading. I've had to sort of adjust some of my routines about reading, but I spent a lot of time with books this year, and these are the best ones that I think you should read. Let's start with this book. This is John M. Barry's book, The Great Influenza. It is an incredible book. It's crazy. You're reading a book about an event 100 years ago, a book written 15 years ago, and it basically feels like it was written about 2020. It's about the Spanish flu, the deadliest epidemic perhaps in world history. And you read these things in here and you're just like, oh my God, people have not changed one bit. You can follow a 24-hour news cycle and you'll get a lot of information, but what will you actually learn? And so one of the reasons I always try to read history, I try to go way back in time, is that I find I learn real information I can actually use. Look, at the beginning of the pandemic, it was like, stay inside, socially distance, wear a mask. And you watch the news every day, and that information hasn't fundamentally changed. And so the reason I read history, I like books like this, is it's giving me insight. It's zooming out. It's the 10,000 foot view. I read this great quote from Hugh Jackman, the actor this year, who's talking about how that studying history from the 10,000 foot view is much better than watching the news. So he's like, go watch the Ken Burns documentary about Vietnam, read Meditations, read a book like this. You'll actually understand more about the present by studying the past. And more importantly, because it's past, it's not politicized. And people aren't as radical about it, and there's less speculation, it just is. So I really got a lot out of this. And John Barry is just an incredible writer. It's riveting too. It's also entertaining, as horrendous as the events are. The Stoics talk about how history is the same thing over and over again on repeat, and this book is just an incredible example of that. And actually, it made me, in part, go back and read Meditations, right? Because Marcus Aurelius is also writing during a pandemic. He's writing during what we now call the Antonine Plague. So I spent a lot of time rereading Meditations this year, and you just notice things. I know I've talked about this in videos before, but you hear him saying things he says, a plague can take your life, but the greater pestilence is the one that destroys your character. He says, it's not unfortunate this happened, it's fortunate that this happened to me and I got through it. And so rereading Meditations was really great. Again, the idea that history is the same thing happening over and over again on loop is really, really important. When we talk about how you never step in the same river twice is really a critical Stoic idea. I think one of the things you learn is just, every time you pick up this book, because the events of the world have changed, now how you perceive what you're reading changes. And so rereading Meditations this year in different chunks was really great. One book I sort of told myself I wasn't going to read at the beginning of the pandemic. My wife told me it was a terrible idea. And she was right in some ways, wrong in others. I reread Cormac McCarthy's The Road. Now, the thing about The Road is, when I read The Road the first time, I was, I think, a sophomore in college. And it's a beautiful book. It's this dystopian, end of the world novel about a man and his son trying to just get somewhere, get to the ocean, trying to survive. Now, when you read this book, the first time it's beautiful, and Cormac McCarthy is a great novelist, but you read it when you have kids. When I finished this book the second time, I literally just walked into my son's room. He was asleep, and I sat on the floor and I just wept. to myself. It just hit me so hard. My friend Brett McKay, who has the site Art of Manliness, he sent me this lighter. It's a Zippo, and it just says, carry the fire, which is a line from the book, which I love. In a world of good and evil, we have to carry the fire. That it's are we carrying goodness forward, right? Marcus Aurelius talks about this actually a lot in Meditations. He says if you want to see good, you have to be good. And the idea that the Stoics were sort of in the darkness of Rome, in the decline and fall of Rome, throughout history, it's been about carrying the fire, about carrying this sort of wisdom, this insight, that virtue is the fire. Are you being a virtuous person? Are you carrying the fire? Or are you the darkness, right? But it's just this kind of Stoic, like put one foot in front of the other, just keep going, don't give up, don't quit. And I think that's kind of what the fire is about too. It's just like, just keep going, just move. One foot in front of the other, keep buggering on, as Churchill said. And so there's a beauty just in their sort of grim determination and their refusal to quit that I think I got some value out of during the pandemic for sure. If you haven't read this, now is the time. Again, who I was when I read it the first time and what was happening in the world is now so dramatically different that the book just hits you on a totally different level. The next book I wanted to recommend, this is Doris Kearns Goodwin's Leadership. And it's an epic book. She's one of the great biographers of her time. She's written biographies of FDR, Theodore Roosevelt, Lyndon Johnson, Abraham Lincoln. She did Team of Rivals, which the movie Lincoln is based on. But what's incredible about this book is it's basically like sort of her masterwork. It's the accumulation of all the wisdom that she's learned applied to one topic. Look, leadership, the Stoics would say, leading when times are great, okay. But what matters is who you are, as Seneca says, like when adversity strikes, right? Leadership is tested by adversity. And I think we've seen in the last 10 months just what sort of fragile, weak leadership looks like when it's tested, and what strong, and what a void that creates, and how necessary sort of strong, wise, compassionate, intelligent leadership is. And I mean, you can see. So when I do books, I keep these like, I fold pages. I think I folded like seriously like almost every other page. Like when I went and did my note cards after I read, like my hand ached. It's just so great. She weaves Lincoln's adversity in with Johnson's adversity and Theodore Roosevelt and Franklin Roosevelt. I think I took a couple things. One, like leaders make hard choices. And 2020 was a year where we had to make hard choices, but really, I mean, we always have to make hard choices. Leaders communicate. They come up with this simple core message that not just of their policies and platforms, but like what the nation or the cause needs in the midst of crises or adversity. And I think we've struggled with that, not just in America, but globally. There was so much good stuff in this book. Sometimes I'll read a book and I'll notice things that like I wish I'd read. Like I have in Stillness is the Key, I have this whole section on Churchill and hobbies. But there's this scene in the book where Churchill's at the White House and he walks in and FDR is playing with his stamp collection. In the midst of all this is going on, he's messing with his stamp collection to calm his mind. And I was like, oh man, I so wish. And Churchill instinctively knew what was happening because he, as a painter, had hobbies that calmed his mind. And sometimes you just find stuff, you're like, oh man, that's too late. So this is a book I wish I'd read earlier. You will wish the same thing. This is a quote from Lyndon Johnson I loved in the book. At times, history and fate meet at a single time in a single place to shape a turning point in man's unending search for freedom. But Johnson liked to say, what convinces is conviction. You have to believe in the argument you're advancing. I got actually a bunch of stuff in here about parenting. She really goes into Lincoln and his complicated relationship with his father. He talks about how his father would beat him, and he says, you don't bind your kids to you with force or make them follow you or follow the rules with force. You bind them to you with love. And so, Lincoln is just this incredible man. I've read so many books about him, but every time I read about Lincoln, I come away stronger and wiser for it. Anyways, definitely read this one. Leadership in Turbulent Times by Doris Kearns Goodwin. And then, so if a pandemic wasn't enough this year, we also had an awakening as far as civil rights goes. It's basically sort of a new civil rights moment going. So I talked about this in my Wall Street Journal thing. I said, one of the things I always try to do is reread books. And I went back and read one of my favorite books, Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison. Just overall an incredible book. And again, this idea that history is the same thing that happens over and over again. This is a book written in 1947. It's a book with a police shooting, with race riots, with agitators trying to exploit the crises on both sides for political gain. It's talking not just about justice and fairness, but also even contradictions and unfairness, even with inside groups. It's just an incredibly rich, powerful book. I'm so glad I reread it. I got different things out of it. There's this scene in the book where he's saying, you gotta play the game. He says, play the game, you can't help that. He's like, but up the ante. And to me, that was a really great breakthrough for me. I think it's a sort of a Stoic concept. It's like, look, there's forces that the world is the world. Marcus Aurelius says you can't go around expecting Plato's Republic. You got to understand the forces that are operating in the universe, the man's sort of nature and all the contradictions and all the unfairnesses. But you got to find a way to play within that, to succeed within that. There's this great sort of epilogue in the book where he's sort of talking about the inherent contradictions in the American system and how we have to sort of redeem that, how we have to get a little bit closer to realizing it. But it's a tricky book. I mean, it's not a book that makes you particularly hopeful, but it is a book that makes you see things differently. He says, he must have meant the principle that we were to affirm the principle which the country was built and not the men, or at least not the men who did the violence. And look, Marcus Aurelius wasn't perfect either, right? He talks in Meditations about, a country of fair laws and free speech and where the rulers respect the rights of their people. I mean, that wasn't what Rome was actually like at all. But in theory, like he had got that from some of the early Stoics. He says he gets that from Helvidius and Cato and Thrasea, but it wasn't even close to actually realizing that yet. So it's about affirming the principles, not necessarily the practices. And I think this is true even in Marcus Aurelius. It's certainly true in America with someone like Thomas Jefferson, who reads the Stoics, who loves ancient philosophy, who writes, that all men are created equal. But then his life is a laughable contradiction in that regard. So I think sometimes events happen in the world and people go and they try to read the trendiest book on that topic. What's at the top of the bestseller list, right? What's being reviewed in the New York Times? And this can work, but I wanted to go read something that stood the test of time. I mean, this book is 70 plus years old. And so I knew it would hold true. And I actually found that I learned more. It was more relevant than anything that I was reading being written about police brutality or civil rights or anything like that. And so as part of that journey, the other book that I read this year that my friend Paul Kicks recommended, I really like epic biographies. So he recommended the Taylor Branch series on Martin Luther King. This is the first one, Parting the Waters, America in the King Years, 1954 to 1963. And then I followed it up with the second book in the trilogy, Pillar of Fire, America in the King Years, 1963 to 1965. These were incredible epic books. Again, I learned far more, not just about civil rights in America, not just about the pursuit of justice, for African Americans, but just about human nature. I mean, look, the Stoic virtues are courage, justice, wisdom, and temperance. And Martin Luther King and the civil rights leaders had to embody those things, not philosophically, not in the abstract, not in the way that Martin Luther King was debating these ideas in seminary as a college student, not the way he would even talk about them to his parishioners, but when he had to go up against presidents and governors and mayors and police captains with dogs, when he had to go to jail for these ideas, he had to actually live them. And that's what philosophy is about. And look, Martin Luther King wasn't a perfect person, certainly closer to the ideal of a perfect person than many of the people he was challenging. But he was a person that struggled, that had contradictions, that was struggling to become who destiny needed him to be. And I mean, even within the civil rights movements, there was disagreements over policy, over practices, over personalities, over approaches. There's all these different things. But he managed to create a movement that changed not just the country, but sort of stands as a shining example of what humans are capable of. And there's this one scene in the book, and I mean, I knew Martin Luther King talked about nonviolence, and you can sort of understand the strategic value of that when you're doing it for the television cameras, you're trying to send a message. But apparently he was like giving a speech. I'd never heard this story. He's giving a speech, and this sort of deranged racist comes up on stage and just punches him, starts punching him. And the people in the crowd, expected, like, obviously he's going to defend himself. And they said they watched him drop his hands like a child. And I was just like, oh my God, like that reminds me of the story of Cato. Cato is punched in a bath and he says, I don't even remember being hit. Just the sheer self-discipline and emotional mastery that would require. You're literally being punched in front of hundreds of people, and you have to remember what your policy is, and you have to stick to it even as you're being hurt because of it. I mean, Martin Luther King was also stabbed. I knew there'd been assassination attempts. I didn't know he got stabbed, and if it had been like a millimeter differently, he would have died. And how calm, like just the sheer physical mastery of it, the mastery of the stress he was under, the brilliance, and that he never let it make him bitter. 2020 is obviously a year where we lost John Lewis, who's going to be a hero subject in a book I'm writing right now as one of the characters. So there's lots of great stuff about John Lewis in here. I mean, again, you can see all the notes that I took. It's just like so many. It's nuts. Another core Stoic virtue, it's not just about being a robot, but it's about justice. And Martin Luther King, the core message of his life was justice. But he understood justice not just in terms of what was fair and what was right, but also how justice works. He understood the system. He says, a law may not make a man love me, he said, but it can stop him from lynching me. He basically became an amateur lawyer. He had to be to understand these things. And there's a brilliant strategic approach to what cities he brought challenges into, where he put resources, when he was willing to go to jail, when he wasn't, when he was willing to compromise and when he wasn't. And last year I read this great book on the suffrage movement and for women, what the passage of the 19th Amendment. It was the same thing. We often think that justice is about being right. Justice is, of course, people should be treated fairly. Of course, people should be judged on the content of their character, not on the color of their skin. But also we live in an imperfect world, and we have an imperfect political system, and we always have. And it's about how you get the rights that you fight for, and how you turn the freighter, how you flip public opinion. I mean, the incredible thing about someone like Martin Luther King is, so he ends up finding that the Democratic Party at that time, with Kennedy and Johnson, is how he's going to pass a lot of this legislation. But at the same time, the Democratic Party was, in the South, the party of segregation. King has to figure out how to navigate these complicated worlds. He's relying on the Justice Department and the FBI in some cases to investigate these civil rights cases. Meanwhile, J. Edgar Hoover is tapping his phones and spying on him and setting traps for him. When Marcus says, "Don't go expecting Plato's Republic," I mean that Martin Luther King didn't grow bitter, that he didn't become jaded, that he didn't give up hope. John Lewis too is incredible, but it was about perseverance. It's about having a cause. John Lewis would say, keep your eyes on the prize. And that larger idea of justice was what helped the civil rights leaders keep their eyes on the prize, endure everything they wanted. So again, this is let's see, this book is a little over 1,000 pages, and this book is almost 800 pages. So that's 1,800 pages. I've got another book about this size in the Taylor Branch series to go. I've learned so much. I've taken God knows how many notes. It was really awesome. Those are the best books that I read this year. The Taylor Branch series on Martin Luther King, Ellison's Invisible Man, Doris Kearns Goodwin's Leadership, Cormac McCarthy's The Road, Meditations, The Great Influenza. These were fantastic books. And then put out a book during a pandemic, which is, let me tell you, very strange. to not tour, but it's been cool. I've been able to do these videos for you guys and connect. So I put out Lives of the Stoics, The Art of Living from Zeno to Marcus Aurelius, because like Martin Luther King, like the leaders in leadership, like the people in the Great Influenza, the Stoics were trying to navigate the real world. And they were trying to apply their philosophy in the real world, as all of us are trying to do. As the Stoics say, it's deeds, not words, that count. It's about putting the stuff into practice. Epictetus says, don't talk about your philosophy, embody it. Marcus Aurelius says, don't talk about what a good man is like, be one. That's what these books helped me do. That's what I tried to write about in this book, Lives of the Stoics. And look, if you want more book recommendations, every month I send out an email at ryanholiday.net where I just recommend the best books that I've read over the last month with little recommendations and links. It's a way to support the channel, support me, but also support great authors doing great writing. I've done this list for 10 years now, recommended thousands of books to, it's almost 300,000 people on the list now. It's been one of my great honors to bring attention to these books. People who have subscribed to the reading list may have already read some of these books. But anyways, those are the best books I read. This is Meditations, the #1 book to reread this year. And be safe. Happy New Year. See you next time. For the Stoics, wisdom was an ongoing process. It was a journey. Zeno said that well-being is realized by small steps, but it's no small thing. So how do we do that? Well, I suggest the Daily Stoic email. You can sign up at dailystoic.com/email. One email every single day, totally free. The best wisdom and insights from the Stoics, from Zeno to Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, and Seneca. Sign up, start your journey. Let me know what you think.